Good morning, everyone. Abhiram, good morning. So, in our this lecture, we were talking about the Montford reforms. 1919. We had talked about its background and provisions. Now we need to critically evaluate it. Right? So, was there any way in which the Montford reforms were an improvement over the Morley-Minto reforms? कुछ नए मोर प्रोग्रेसिव फीचर्स थे इसमें या नहीं थे? थे. ठीक है. So certain positive developments were definitely there. Now, would it be fair to say that on the whole, the Montford reforms were in keeping with the demands and aspirations of the Indians, or did they end up further dissatisfying Indians? They ended up further dissatisfying Indians. That means that although there were some positive aspects to this act, on the whole, its limitations overshadowed its strengths and it failed to satisfy the Indian nationalists. तो इस तरह से हम इसको critically evaluate करेंगे. ठीक है. Now, what were the positive aspects? क्या थे? First of all, the legislature was enlarged. Secondly, the proportion of elected members of the legislatures was also increased. Thirdly, the element of direct election was introduced for the first time. Fourthly, the electorate or the franchise was also broadened with more people getting the right to vote. For the first time, women got the right to vote. Further, for the first time, legislators were given the power to vote on parts of the budget. And pass adjournment motion for the first time. The concept of responsible government with the element of collective security was introduced partially at the provincial level. A long-standing demand of the nationalists to separate the expenses and salaries of the Secretary of State for India and his staff from the Indian budget was accepted. The principle of bicameralism was introduced in Indian legislature for the first time. For the first time, the federating units of the British Union of India were given representation in the central legislature. Further, legislative devolution was introduced for the first time, and in this way, a big step was taken towards the introduction of actual federalism. ठीक है? So कुछ पॉजिटिव एस्पेक्ट्स इसमें जरूर थे. However, the act failed completely to satisfy the nationalists. Due to its inherent shortcomings and its duplicitous nature. When we are saying duplicitous nature, मतलब कि कई सारे एस्पेक्ट्स इसके ऐसे थे जो कि देखने में लगता था कि पॉजिटिव एस्पेक्ट्स है, लेकिन वो छलावा था. इट वाज ऑल अ मिराज. देयर रियल पर्पस वाज समथिंग डिफरेंट. द मोस्ट कंट्रोवर्शियल एस्पेक्ट वाज diarchy. This was a system that was designed to fail, and it was introduced by the British in order to blame its future failure upon Indians, thus justifying the continuation of British rule by arguing that Indians are unfit for rule, that Indians have failed to function and deliver within the framework of responsible government, and hence the continuation of British rule is necessary. Apart from this, while direct elections were introduced, the institution of separate electorates was expanded, thus dividing the Indians politically even deeper. Moreover, while the franchise had been expanded, there were still quite stringent educational and property qualifications in place, and only about 3% of all Indians could vote. Moreover, while the legislature's size had been expanded and the proportion of elected members had been increased, the presence of a large number of nominated members diluted the principle of popular sovereignty. ठीक है? Further, the extraordinary powers enjoyed by the governors and governor general provided several avenues to bypass the constitutional legislative process, lawmaking process. ठीक है. Further, although the element of responsible government had been introduced, the principle of collective security, which is collective responsibility, which is the bedrock of any parliamentary system, was almost entirely absent. It was actually absolutely absent at the central level, and it was introduced only partially at the provincial level. Okay? So collective responsibility was almost entirely absent. Further, while the legislators had been given the right to pass adjournment motions, they did not have the power to censure the government. ठीक है, दोनों में फर्क होता है. If the legislatures do not have the right to censor the government, that means they cannot bring any popular action against the government, such as a vote of no confidence. On the other hand, the governors would have the power to topple the elected governments and dissolve the legislature without showing any cause. ठीक है. So there was no power of censure, and thus legislative control over the executive was weak. It was marginal. And finally, while the legislators had been given the power to vote on parts of the budget, they could not vote on the budget as a whole. ठीक है. And thus financial control of the legislature over the government was also absent. In the matter of budgeting, legislation, and executive control, the role of the legislature was suggestive. It was recommendatory, advisory in nature rather than actual or absolute in nature. Okay? And in this scenario, a new reality emerges that the provisions of the Montford reforms were deliberately designed to give the appearance of substantial progress, but in reality, they were absolutely hollow. Thus, the Montford reforms were an attempt by the government to diffuse the rising tide of nationalist anger, and they were never meant to succeed. Rather, it was meant to fail. And in this failure, it was meant to further strengthen the machinery of constitutional autocracy that the government had been trying to build ever since it had introduced the series of constitutional reforms. तो दूसरे शब्द में हम ये बोल सकते हैं that the Montford reforms provided for an autocratic form of government through constitutional means. So it gave constitutional legitimacy to an autocratic regime. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, while criticizing the institution of diarchy when it was introduced at the central level by the Government of India Act 1935, famously said that diarchy is a vehicle that is all brakes and no engine. तो ऐसी गाड़ी कभी आगे बढ़ सकती है? At most what it can do is roll downhill. ठीक है? And that is exactly what the principle of diarchy was supposed to achieve on the British. It was meant to ensure the failure of Indians, and Indians could not could not uh, aspire to prosper under this system. ठीक है? इतना समझ में आया है? Now take down a question. Discussing the merits and limitations of the Montford reforms discuss their impact on Indian history. Full stop. 200 words, 15 marks. Question समझ में आया है? Discussing the merits and limitations of the Montford reforms. Merits and limitations तो आप discuss कर लोगे. What was its impact on Indian history? क्या? First of all, it contributed to the rising wave of popular post-war discontent against British rule. Ever since the end of the war, the British had repeatedly frustrated and angered the Indian nationalists and their aspirations through their questionable actions, such as introduction of the Rowlatt Act, the suppression of the Rowlatt Satyagraha, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and the Hunter Inquiry Commission. The Montford reforms were probably the last opportunity of the British to retain or to win once again the goodwill of Indians that they had during the First World War. But the provision of diarchy of the Montford reforms squandered this opportunity. Okay? So you can say, lost the last opportunity to regain the Indian goodwill. Thirdly, The introduction of diarchy became one of the major causes behind the Khilafat non-cooperation movement. In fact, one of the objectives of the movement was to undo the diarchy wrongs. So it gave a major target to the Indian nationalists in the form of diarchy. ठीक है. Fourthly, by failing to give even the slightest semblance of Swaraj, which India had been demanding for a very long time, by introducing the corrupted principle of diarchy, the Montford reforms actually ended up, in fact, making the demand for Swaraj even louder. And in this, it gave a new objective to the nationalists during the non-cooperation movement. Main objective was attainment of Swaraj. So they also gave a major objective to the Indian nationalists, that is Swaraj. Furthermore, by making the Montford reforms so poor and unattractive to Indians, by and large, they elicited the sentiment of boycott among Indians, thus giving a major method to the Indian nationalists during the non-cooperation movement. That is, boycott of the Montford reforms and the elections to the legislative councils. So they also gave a major strategy to the Indian nationalists, that is boycott, amounting to non-cooperation. ठीक है. Now, while the non-cooperation movement did not succeed in ending diarchy or attaining Swaraj, we cannot say that with the decline of the non-cooperation movement, the opposition against diarchy or the demand for Swaraj also evaporated. In fact, they became the long-term demands of Indian nationalism even after the decline of the non-cooperation. So we can say that the Montford reforms continued to fuel Indian opposition on a long-term basis. ठीक है. Further, the introduction of diarchy and partially responsible government forced the nationalists to have a conversation about responsible government, about the idea of Swaraj and what these should mean in real life. Therefore, in response to the flawed principles of the Montford reforms, the nationalists came up with a mature response, a more comprehensive and well-founded response, which guided the national movement in the future years up to independence. It forced a conversation among the nationalists regarding issues such as Swaraj, responsible government, and popular sovereignty. And finally, we can say that the anger caused due to the Montford reforms probably gave to India its tallest leader in the modern history, that is Mahatma Gandhi. Now, Mahatma Gandhi had already proven himself on the national political scene through his three early Gandhian satyagrahas and the Rowlatt Satyagraha as well. However, while the three early Gandhian satyagrahas were localized satyagrahas and the Rowlatt strike, Rowlatt Satyagraha, had to be called off shortly after it was announced, the non-cooperation movement is what transformed Mahatma Gandhi into the actual father of the nation. That all eyes were looking towards him for guidance, and they continued to do so long after the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement. His politics proved to be quite effective, and he was permanently able to keep the British on the back foot. ठीक है? So इस तरह से इसने इम्पैक्ट किया मॉडर्न इंडियन हिस्ट्री को. क्लियर है इतना? तो इसको हम जल्दी से किसमें लेजिस्लेचर का एनलार्जमेंट, वो तो आप बोल सकते हो, लेकिन वही है ना कि आपको मेरिट्स, लिमिटेशन सब कुछ डिस्कस करना है, उसके बाद इम्पैक्ट के बारे में बात करना है. Yes, you can obviously point out that women were given the right to vote for the first time. More people were brought within the electorate for the first time. The principle of direct elections was introduced for the first time. These deepened the concept of Indian democracy, strengthened the concept of popular sovereignty. But हम उनको ऑलरेडी एड्रेस कर चुके हैं यहाँ पर, है ना? तो एक तो अगर उनको लिखेंगे तो रिपीटिशन होगा. सेकेंडली, these things are more important if you take a bird's eye view, एक overall view अगर आप लेते हो, तो these things are more important than those other things. वो procedural details हैं. Those you have already addressed in a previous portion of your answer. We are talking about the short-term and long-term impacts of the Montfort reforms on the Indian history as a whole. So इसलिए यहाँ पे फोकस करेंगे तो शायद ज्यादा फायदा होगा. हाँ, अगर आपको चाहते हो तो यू कैन इंट्रोड्यूस इट इन अ वे कि आप एक में ही वो सारी की सारी चीजों को या तो लिख लो, और यू कैन डू इट इन अ वे दैट फिट्स दिस नैरेटिव कि हाउ इट स्ट्रेंथेंड इंडियन नेशनलिज्म एज अ होल. तो हम यहाँ पे बात कर रहे हैं इम्पैक्ट ऑन इंडियन हिस्ट्री, सो you should read it as Indian nationalism. Clear? Right. So now give the heading critical evaluation. Critical evaluation of the Montford reforms. Of the Montford reforms. लिखो. The Montford reforms were directly responsible for the launch of the non-cooperation movement. Stop. Obviously, they had failed to fulfill nationalist aspirations. Nationalist aspirations. Failed to fulfill nationalist aspirations. Full stop. However, before discussing their limitations, their limitations, comma, its positive aspects, its positive aspects must be noted, must be noted. 1 2 3 4 करके आगे लिखो. Number 1, the legislature was enlarged, comma, giving greater representation, giving greater representation. Number 2, the proportion of elected members was raised, comma, thus strengthening the concept of popular sovereignty, thus strengthening the concept of popular sovereignty. Number 3, the introduction of direct elections strengthened representative democracy, strengthened representative democracy. Number 4, the democratic exercise became accessible to a greater chunk of Indians with the broadening of the franchise, full stop. Giving the right to vote, next point, giving the right to vote to women was the first step towards ensuring political equality among the genders, full stop. The financial, next point, the financial and executive control of the legislature over the government was strengthened by giving it the right to vote on parts of the budget, and pass adjournment motions, and pass adjournment motions. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट कौन सा नंबर है? 7. लिखो. For the first time, comma, the element of responsible government was introduced in India. With the presence of popularly elected ministers in the provinces. Next, number 8. A major source of the drain of wealth was plugged, P-L-U-G-G-E-D, was plugged by separating the expenses of the Secretary of State for India and his office from the Indian budget. Number 9. The introduction of bicameralism at the center was a step towards decentralization and federalization of the government. Lastly, लिखो number 10. Finally, comma, legislative devolution between the center and the states laid the foundations of Indian federalism, which emerged fully under which act? Under the Government of India Act 1935. Under the Government of India Act 1935. So it provided for a full-fledged Federation of India. लेकिन उसकी शुरुआत यहीं से हुई है, ठीक है? तो लेजिस्लेटिव डेवोल्यूशन से और बाइकैमरलिज्म से. क्लियर? नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. Despite having these positive aspects, comma, the Montford reforms are remembered largely as a tool used by the British to subvert Indian nationalism. To subvert Indian nationalism. Full stop. Their limitations far outweigh any strengths and its content reveals the duplicitous intent behind these reforms. ठीक है? सब points once again 1 2 3 4 करके. Number 1, the most controversial provision of this act was the introduction of diarchy in the provinces. Full stop. सब पॉइंट इसी में लिखो. Diarchy provided for an impractical and unscientific division of administrative subjects between elected and appointed officials. Full stop. Next sub point. The most important subjects were kept in the reserved list, while those which depended upon the control of the reserved subjects, comma, were put in the transferred list. For example, the reserved list had subjects such as finance, police, power, and irrigation. Whereas the transferred list had subjects such as health, education, industry, and agriculture. ठीक है? without control of finance, could the delivery of health or education be given? नहीं हो सकता है. Without control of power, could good service to industries be delivered? No. Without control of irrigation, could agriculture be promoted? नहीं हो सकता है. So the division was done deliberately in such a manner that all the responsibility was given to the Council of Ministers, जो कि elected थे, by putting all these subjects with a public interface in the transferred list, whereas all the power was placed within the reserved list by giving all these important subjects to the appointed officials. ठीक है, रिजर्व लिस्ट में इसको रख दिया गया. इज दिस क्लियर? नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो. The system was designed to create constant friction and fail. Full stop. By doing this, the British wanted to demonstrate that Indians were unfit to rule. That Indians were unfit to rule. Is this clear? So that is why the principle of diarchy is considered to be the most controversial, because it divorced responsibility from power. Those who had the responsibility did not have the power to fulfill that responsibility, and those who had the power did not have any responsibilities to fulfill. Therefore, while those without power would be held accountable, while those with power, with the actual power, would go scot-free without any accountability. Okay? So this is the reason why it is controversial. Next, number 2 likho. The Montford reforms further expanded the apparatus of separate electorates, comma, thus widening the scope of divide and rule and sowing further social divisions among Indians. Next up, point number 3. While the franchise had been expanded, comma, voting restrictions remained in place. Full stop. Only 3% of Indians had the right to vote. As such, the bulk of the ordinary Indian masses remained disenfranchised. remained disenfranchised. ठीक है. Number 4, while the proportion of elected members had been increased, comma, the legislatures continued to have the legislatures continued to have a large number of nominated members, comma, thus diluting the principle of representative democracy. Number 5, furthermore, comma, responsible government was weakened by the high degree of executive privilege in legislative matters. Full stop. The governors and governor general had several paths to bypass the legislative route of lawmaking. Number 6, next लिखो. Further, comma, the concept of collective responsibility comma, which forms the very basis of parliamentary democracy, comma, was almost entirely absent. While the central government had no elected ministers, comma, provincial ministers and governments could be summarily removed by the governors. Okay. Next, number 7. लिखो. Number 7. The financial and executive control of the legislature over the government was superficial, was superficial, was superficial. Full stop. They could neither censure the government, they could neither censure the government nor vote on the budget as a whole. Vote on the budget as a whole. अगला मेन पॉइंट लिखो. Therefore, comma, the Montford reforms, the Montford reforms lacked any real substance, lacked any real substance, and represented a hollow mechanism, a hollow mechanism that was meant to strengthen, that was meant to strengthen constitutional autocracy while weakening constitutional autocracy while weakening Indian nationalism. Full stop. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru accurately captured the failing of the Montford reforms by observing that, within inverted commas, diarchy is a vehicle that is all brakes and no engine. That is all brakes and no engine. Full stop. Next main point. The Montford reforms would go on to have a major impact on the evolution of Indian nationalism. On the evolution of Indian nationalism. Full stop. सब पॉइंट्स 1 2 3 4 करके लिखो. नंबर 1, their shortcomings contributed to the rising wave of popular discontent against British rule. Number 2, with these, comma, the British lost their last opportunity to regain Indian goodwill, Indian goodwill, and made the non-cooperation movement, the non-cooperation movement inevitable, inevitable. Number 3, the Montford reforms, the Montford reforms gave a new target, objective, and approach to Indian nationalists, to Indian nationalists in the form of diarchy, Swaraj, and non-cooperation respectively, and non-cooperation respectively. Full stop. Next point, next main point. These elements continued to remain the primary driving force of Indian nationalism for a long period, for a long period of Indian nationalism for a long period, even after the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement, even after the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement. So even though the non-cooperation movement was withdrawn, Mahatma Gandhi, through the Bardoli Resolution of 1922, proclaimed that the demand of Swaraj would remain the objective of the Congress, that the Congress would not participate in the elections to the legislatures because they were based on the principle of diarchy, and that they would not continue the idea of non-cooperation with British rule by not participating in the elections or in the legislatures, British legislatures. Okay? So this became the long-term strategy, demand, and target of the Indian nationalists. Next, number 4, 5. ये सब point था. Number 5. Further, the Montford reforms also initiated a conversation within the nationalist camp, about concepts such as Swaraj, camp on concepts such as Swaraj, responsible government, and popular sovereignty. ऐसा क्यों हुआ? Because through the Montford reforms, the British had given their own definition of these concepts and Indians now needed to respond to it. Okay? Full stop likho. Through this conversation, comma, these ideas were given body, were given body and expressed in a more cogent, comprehensive and concrete manner. A more cogent, that means clear. Comprehensive, that means covering various aspects, and concrete manner, that means vaguely नहीं बोला जाएगा, उसके जो डिफरेंट एस्पेक्ट्स हैं उनको लीगली डिफाइन करने की कोशिश करी जाएगी. क्लियर है? एंड फाइनली लिखो नंबर 6, the Montford reforms comma by preparing the stage for the non-cooperation movement, comma directly contributed to the rise of Mahatma Gandhi as the undisputed leader of the national movement, as the undisputed leader of the national movement. Full stop. Gandhi would continue Gandhi would continue to lead Indians right up to independence. Full stop. His philosophy and methods would guide India beyond independence. Full stop. Next main point. Therefore, the Montford reforms mark a major turning point in Indian nationalism. Full stop. They represented a challenge. Comma, to address which Indian nationalism had to mature and evolve. ठीक है? तो कोई बायोग्राफीज वगैरह आप लोग अगर पढ़ते होगे या देखते होगे, कोई ऑटोबायोग्राफीज या बायोग्राफीज या बायोपिक्स वगैरह, तो उसमें आपको ज्यादातर में एक ऐसा सिचुएशन आता है कि एक बहुत बड़ा सा चैलेंज आता है, जिसके बाद जो सब्जेक्ट होता है उस बायोपिक का, बायोग्राफी का, दे हैव टू चेंज देमसेल्व्स, दे हैव टू मैच्योर and do that very quickly in order to address that challenge. That was what happened to the Congress also in light of the Montford reforms. Clear? तो ये हो गए Montford reforms. And finally, the final issue which resulted in the rising tide of post-war discontent was the Khilafat issue. What do you mean by the word Khilafat? क्या होता है? नहीं, उसको बोलते हैं मुखालिफत, टू बी अगेंस्ट समवन, टू अपोज समवन. ठीक है. खिलाफत इज द नेम ऑफ द ऑफिस ऑफ द खलीफा. ठीक है. तो जैसे सुल्तान की सल्तनत होती है, किंग का किंगडम होता है, एम्परर का एम्पायर होता है, खान का खानिट होता है, वैसे ही खलीफा का खिलाफत होता है. खलीफा और केलिफ कौन होता था? नहीं नहीं, what did this office represent? Not only the spiritual leader, but also the political leader. Of whom? Of all Muslims? नहीं. देखो, the Islamic community, global Islamic community is not homogeneous. उसमें अंदर कई सारे divisions हैं, कई सारे sects होते हैं, linguistic and national differences, cultural differences present हैं. But for a particular sect of Muslims, जो कि सुन्नी मुस्लिम्स हैं, the office of the Khalifa used to represent the universal religious as well as political leader of the entire community of Muslims. So in the eyes of the Sunnis, he was the universal leader of all Muslims. बाकी लोग नहीं मानते थे. ठीक है. The Khalifa at that point of time and for the 400 years before this had been the Ottoman Sultan. Ottoman dynasty कहां पे रूल करता था? Turkey and its territories, right? Now, why do you think that a movement emerged to defend or support the Khalifa during this period only? First World War चल रहा था, and the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were locked in a struggle for survival against the British, French, Americans, and Russians. इनको बोलते थे सेंट्रल पावर्स. They were known as the Entente powers or Allied powers. ठीक है. Now, those who were supporting the Khalifa would obviously be supporting this camp, the central power, and by definition, they would be opposing all the enemies of the Khalifa, the British, French, Americans, and the Russians. Now, in the backdrop of the First World War, as the war progressed, सब लोगों को दिखने लग गया था कि in the end होने क्या वाला था. The writing was clear on the wall for everyone to see. And Muslims across the world came out in support of the Khalifa in order to defend him, his empire, and the rights of ordinary Muslims against the aggression of the Allied powers. Clear? Now, this was a pan-Islamist. That means a movement which affects the entire Islamic community across the world. So it was popular in all countries which had a large concentration of Muslims. The Indian subcontinent was one such country. Therefore, the Khilafat movement was affecting India in a major way as well. इनके डिमांड्स क्या थे? That first, the Khalifa should not be toppled. He should not be removed. He should be allowed to continue ruling the Ottoman Empire. Secondly, that the Ottoman Empire should not be broken up and divided among the victorious powers, that sufficient territories must be left under the Khalifa to allow him to continue ruling. And thirdly, that the Khalifa should be allowed to retain control over the holy Islamic sites. तो तीन holy Islamic sites जहां पे खलीफा का nominal control होता था, he was responsible for the security of the Muslim pilgrims going to these places. कौन सी places? Makkah and Medina in Saudi Arabia, present day Saudi Arabia, and finally जेरूसलम जहां पे अल अक्सा मॉस्क है. ठीक है. एंड द खलीफा's control over the holy Islamic sites should be retained. Clear? What were the Khilafatists concerned about? The exact opposite. कि खलीफा को अंग्रेज आकर के हटा देंगे. They are going to dismember the Ottoman Empire. They are going to parcel out its territories among themselves, leaving no self-determination for the Turks and thus no protection for the Muslims who want to visit the sites under the Khalifa's control. And finally, that the allies are ultimately going to desecrate the holy Islamic sites. तो इन सबको प्रिवेंट करने की जरूरत है. Clear? Now, what was the Khilafatist strategy? क्या था? जंग छिड़ी हुई थी. तो did the Khilafatists of the Indian subcontinent come out in support of the Khalifa against the British militarily? नहीं. ठीक है. तो initially they tried to use the moderate methods of persuasion, prayer, petitions, and protests. While the war was ongoing, to end the war with the Khalifa, to call for an armistice and make a general amnesty towards the Khalifa. And after the war ended, to not treat the defeated caliph too harshly, not to dismember Turkey, to allow the caliph to retain the control of the holy Islamic sites, etc. ये सब के लिए persuasion करने की कोशिश करी. However, this strategy failed completely. One of the prominent leaders of the Khilafat movement in India, Muhammad Ali Johar, one of the Johar brothers, one of the Ali brothers, younger one, he had even led a deputation to Europe when the peace treaties against the defeated powers were being drafted, were being signed. और वहां पे उन्होंने एक केस किया था in defense of the Khalifa. However, all these appeals were ignored. And once it became that the allies are not in a mood to listen to this persuasion, then किस तरह के मेथड्स यूज होंगे? रैडिकल मेथड्स. वायलेंस अभी भी यूज नहीं होगा, बट रैडिकल मेथड्स, एक्सट्रीमिस्ट मेथड्स. In the form of calls for boycott and non-cooperation. Provincial Khilafat committees were organized across the entire subcontinent, where prominent Muslim leaders called upon ordinary Muslims to come on the streets and oppose British rule openly. An All India Khilafat Committee was also organized. By bringing together these provincial committees, Mahatma Gandhi saw a golden opportunity to cement Hindu-Muslim unity and to bring Hindus and Muslims onto a common platform of political action against British rule. Therefore, he approached the All India Khilafat Committee leaders and was appointed by them as the president of the All India Khilafat Committee. Now, during the First World War, many of the Khilafat leaders had been put under house arrest. After the end of the war, following the principle of general amnesty to all the political prisoners, they were also freed. They joined hands with Mahatma Gandhi and traveled across the country addressing large public meetings attended by both Hindus as well as Muslims. The Muslim leaders were able to attract the Muslim masses. Mahatma Gandhi and his followers were able to attract the Hindu masses. तो एक ही रैली में दोनों प्रेजेंट होते थे एंड वहां पर अंग्रेजों को क्रिटिसाइज किया जाता था एंड पीपल वर इंस्पायर्ड, वर एनकरेज्ड टू कम आउट ऑन द स्ट्रीट्स, राइट. फाइनली ऑल इंडिया खिलाफत कमिटी ने एक प्रोग्राम लॉन्च किया, दैट ऑफ बॉयकॉट एंड नॉन कोऑपरेशन. इतने में क्या हुआ? तिलक की डेथ हो गई 1 अगस्त 1920 को. ठीक है, 1 अगस्त 1920 को ही एक ड्राफ्ट पब्लिश हुआ. किस चीज का? द ट्रीटी दैट वुड अल्टीमेटली बी इम्पोज्ड अपॉन द ऑटोमन एम्पायर. एंड वहां पे पता लगा कि खिलाफतिस्ट को जो जो चीजों का डर था वही हो रहा है. द खलीफा वॉज नॉट रिमूव्ड बट ही वॉज weakened considerably. Major portions of the Ottoman Empire were taken away. All the non-Turkish territories were given to either Britain or France as mandates to govern on behalf of the League of Nations. And the Khalifa also lost control over the holy Islamic sites. Palestine, for example, became a British mandate. और हिजाज में जहां पे मक्का और मदीना है वहां पे एक ब्रिटिश क्लाइंट स्टेट, द हाउस ऑफ साउद को एस्टैब्लिश कर दिया गया, राइट. एंड दिस अलार्म्ड द मुस्लिम्स. पीपल वर ऑलरेडी ऑन द स्ट्रीट. दे हैड ऑलरेडी बीन इंडोक्ट्रिनेटेड अगेंस्ट द खिलाफतिस्ट इशू बाय बोथ कांग्रेस लीडर्स एज वेल एज मुस्लिम लीडर्स एंड अ स्पॉन्टेनियस प्रोटेस्ट स्टार्टेड. ठीक है. फर्दर the Congress, which had not yet officially joined the All India Khilafat movement, It also adopted a non-cooperation resolution at a special session in Calcutta in September 1931 with its own objectives. तो इसके own objectives क्या थे कांग्रेस के? The attainment of Swaraj, undoing the Punjab wrongs, and undoing the diarchy wrongs. ठीक है? Now, the non-cooperation resolution was adopted by the Congress once again at its annual session at Nagpur in 1920. And this is the way in which the Khilafat and non-cooperation movements were merged together, and they would continue to run parallelly right up to their withdrawal in 1922. Clear है इतना? तो इसको जल्दी से लिख लेते हैं. Can give the heading Khilafat Issue. अच्छा, क्वेश्चन आया, Sir, if the Ottoman Sultan, who was the Khalifa, was the spiritual and political leader of all Muslims in the eyes of Sunnis, did the Mughals also consider him as such and respect his authority? नहीं, मुगलों का थोड़ा अलग इक्वेशन था. Since the Khalifa was not only a spiritual figure, but also a political leader, and the Mughals were competing for this position. That means they were also political leaders who wanted to elevate themselves to the status of spiritual leaders. There was an inherent competition between the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire. Now, initially, the Mughal emperors continued to respect the Khalifa, but from the period of Akbar onwards, there was growing aloofness. In fact, मुगल आर्ट में भी ये चीज रिफ्लेक्ट होती है. इफ यू लुक एट द पोर्ट्रेट्स ऑफ द मुगल एम्परर्स, तो वहां पर उनको दिखाया जाता है हैविंग अ कॉन्फ्रेंस विद द ऑटोमन एम्परर, ऑटोमन खलीफा और द शाह ऑफ पर्शिया, राइट? दीज वर द थ्री गन पाउडर एम्पायर्स ऑफ एशिया, एंड इन तीनों के बीच में कॉम्पिटिशन रहता था. तो जो मुगल आर्ट है उसमें the Mughal emperor would be given a greater place of prominence and the other two would be shown as their juniors. लेकिन अगर आप वही ऑटोमन आर्ट को देखो या फिर पर्शियन आर्ट को देखो इस पीरियड के, तो वहां पे उन लोगों को ज्यादा प्रोमिनेंस दिया जाता है. ठीक है? फर्दर विद द आइडिया ऑफ विद द डिक्री ऑफ मजहरनामा, द डिक्री ऑफ इनफैलिबिलिटी, Akbar in 1579 assumed unto himself all the characteristics of the Khalifa, all the notional powers of the Khalifa, including being the chief interpreter of the faith. He also assumed certain titles such as Insan-e-Kamil or Imam-e-Adil. These were titles that were traditionally reserved only for the Prophet. But now, by assuming these, he was claiming indirectly superiority and seniority over the Ottoman Khalifa. So yes, while the Mughals were Sunnis, they did not have the same kind of reverence towards the Ottoman Sultan, towards the Khalifa. इसके पीछे कुछ historical factors भी हैं. The Mughal Empire, its founder was from Samarkand. अब Samarkand was in Central Asia, and during the reign of Babur, a major power struggle was going on in this region. Babur, who was Turkish, was fighting against the Uzbeks for control of the Fargana Valley, for control of the whole of this region, Samarkand wale region ke liye, right? While the Uzbeks were being supported by the Ottoman Empire, Babur and the Mughals were being supported by the Safavid Empire of Persia. The Safavid Empire was a Shia power, while the Ottoman Empire was a Sunni power. So from the very beginning, there had been a slight disconnect between the Mughals and Sunni Islam, and the Mughals had become quite close to Shiaism. Further, throughout the entire period of Mughal rule, a large number of Persian scholars continued to pour into India from either Iran directly or from Central Asia. Thus, Sufism and the Sufi values, the Sufi religious doctrines were also incorporated into the reigning philosophy of the Mughals, right? तो इसलिए Mughals dogmatically Sunni नहीं थे. Yes, they were Sunni, but being Sunni Muslim was merely an identity for them. It did not define them entirely. Further, they had to refine their views even more given the peculiarity of the political situation in India, where the ruler was a religious minority and the bulk of the masses, his subject population, followed a civilizational system that was very distinct from the conservative and traditional values of the new minority ruling class. तो उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में भी अपने व्यूज को इन्हें रिफाइन करना पड़ा. So Akbar and the later Mughal and the Mughals after him were constantly searching for new political positions, new philosophical positions, and you can say philosophical structures to justify their absolute political as well as spiritual control. Okay? So they did not respect the Ottoman sultans or the Khalifa's authority as much as ordinary Sunni Muslims may have. Clear hai? All right. हाँ, तो अभी क्या लिखा आपने? अच्छा, शुरू करना है. Give me a couple of minutes. I'll be right back. All right. Sorry about that. हाँ, तो the Khilafat issue. Write down. The word Khilafat refers to the office of the Caliph. The office of the Caliph, who was considered to be the supreme religious and political leader of all Muslims by a large sect of Muslims. Full stop. Next point. The Khilafat movement was a pan-Islamist movement that affected all countries with large Muslim populations during and after the First World War. Full stop. This included the Indian subcontinent as well. Full stop. Next point. This movement was organized in defense of the Caliph. As Muslims were concerned that the allies would A, B, and C. A, topple the Khalifa, topple the Caliph, topple the Caliph. B. Dismember the Ottoman Empire, dismember the Ottoman Empire. And C. Desecrate, desecrate holy Islamic sites, holy Islamic sites such as Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. सब हेडिंग दो. The leaders and their strategy. The leaders and their strategy. So stop. Write down. The prominent leaders of the Khilafat movement included the Ali brothers. कौन कौन? शौकत अली and Muhammad Ali Jauhar. Shaukat Ali and Muhammad Ali Jauhar. मौलाना हसरत मोहानी, मौलाना हसरत मोहानी, अब्दुल बारी, मौलाना अब्दुल बारी, हकीम अजमल खान, and मौलाना अबुल कलाम आजाद. मौलाना अबुल कलाम आजाद. तो ये किस तरह के लीडर्स हैं? आर दे कॉन्जर्वेटिव मुस्लिम लीडर्स और प्रोग्रेसिव मुस्लिम लीडर्स? कॉन्जर्वेटिव मुस्लिम लीडर्स, आप इनके प्रोफेशन से ही अंदाजा लगा सकते हैं. कोई हकीम है, कोई मौलाना है, कोई मौलवी है, ये सब है. लॉयर्स, डॉक्टर्स, प्रोफेशनल, जर्नलिस्ट, एजुकेटर्स, ये सब हैं इसमें? नहीं है. इसमें मोहम्मद अली जिन्ना का नाम इंक्लूड होता है? नहीं होता है. व्हाई? बिकॉज द मुस्लिम मिडिल क्लासेस were against the Khilafat movement. They did not want Indian Muslims to get involved in the defense of a foreign ruler simply because of religious affiliation. डायरेक्टली कोई इंडियन इंटरेस्ट अफेक्ट हो रहे थे कि खलीफा के साथ क्या होता है? कुछ नहीं अफेक्ट हो रहा था. एंड देयरफॉर द मुस्लिम मिडिल क्लास इंक्लूडिंग लीडर्स सच एज मोहम्मद अली जिन्ना wanted Indian Muslims to remain aloof from this. ठीक है? They wanted Indian Muslims to oppose the British, but only along secular lines. They wanted good relations with Hindus, but not on the basis of a common religious action, a common religious movement. ठीक है? Next main point लिखो. As we can see, comma, the Khilafat leadership consisted of conservative and traditional leaders. Full stop. On the other hand, on the other hand, the Muslim middle class leaders, the Muslim middle class leaders were opposed to the Khilafat movement. Were opposed to the Khilafat movement. Full stop. Sub point. Leaders such as Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leaders such as Muhammad Ali Jinnah did not want Indian Muslims to agitate politically, to agitate politically on a religious issue, on a religious issue, to agitate politically on a religious issue. Full stop. Further, he argued that since the material conditions of Indian Muslims would not be directly affected, would not be directly affected by the future of the caliph, comma, they should not defend him, they should not defend him on religious grounds only, on religious grounds only. Full stop. Moreover, the office of the caliph, the office of the caliph was an antiquated institution, was an antiquated institution based on religious and dynastic customs. Full stop. According to Jinnah, comma, such institutions had no place in the modern world. In the modern world. And thus, Indian Muslims should not waste their energy defending them. Should not waste their energy defending them. ठीक है? Next main point लिखो. Nevertheless, the calculated and logical arguments of the middle class Muslim leaders could not tame, could not tame, tame, T-A-M-E, could not tame the raw power, the raw power of religious emotion. And the conservative leaders gained immense popularity, gained immense popularity. Gained immense popularity. ठीक है? Next main point लिखो. Initially, comma, the Khilafatists used moderate methods, full stop, through prayers, petitions, public meetings, speeches, and writings, comma, they tried to convince, they tried to convince or to persuade would be a better word, to persuade the British to make peace with the Caliph while the war was ongoing, and not to treat the Caliph harshly, once the war had ended. Once the war had ended. Once the war had ended. Full stop. सब पॉइंट लिखो. मोहम्मद अली जौहर even led a deputation to Paris in order to persuade the allies to treat the Caliph mildly. Next main point. However, their appeals were ignored. Full stop. The government even put prominent Khilafat leaders under house arrest. Full stop. They were finally released after the end of the war. But by this time, comma. The central powers had been defeated, while the allies, seemed prepared, to extract revenge, ठीक है? Next main point. Now the Khilafatists adopted a more militant approach. Militant मतलब extremist और radical approach. A more militant approach. Full stop. Several provincial Khilafat committees were set up, and the leaders began preparing the masses for direct action against British rule. Full stop. Next point. In early 1919, the All India Khilafat Committee was created. With the following demands. A and B. A. The office of the Khalifa must remain intact. B. The Khalifa should retain control of sufficient territories and C. The holy Islamic sites should remain under its control. Under his control. Full stop. Next main point. When it became clear that the British would not accept these demands, the All India Khilafat Committee began a program of boycott and non-cooperation. Full stop. Sub point. Under Mahatma Gandhi's leadership, comma, the Khilafat movement was integrated into a larger movement of the general public, involving both Hindus and Muslims, of the general public, comma, involving both Hindus and Muslims against British rule, comma, namely the non-cooperation movement, namely the non-cooperation movement. नेमली दी नॉन कोऑपरेशन मूवमेंट. ठीक है, तो ये हो गया दी खिलाफत इशू. टेक डाउन अ क्वेश्चन. What were the major factors behind the Khilafat movement? Discuss its significance in Indian history. पहला वाला पोर्शन तो आप एड्रेस कर लोगे, तो हमने डिटेल में देख लिया है खिलाफत इशू क्या था. ठीक है, सिग्निफिकेंस इन इंडियन हिस्ट्री. ठीक है, फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल it was the point of entry of Indian Muslims into mass politics. ठीक है, secondly it became the platform for Hindu Muslim unity during the non-cooperation movement. And this Hindu-Muslim unity was not something that had emerged spontaneously. The nationalist leadership had been working towards it ever since 1916, ever since the Home Rule movement and the Lucknow Pact. So these were the fruits of nationalist efforts since the Lucknow Pact and Home Rule movement. With this, the divide and rule policy failed, and the British appeared almost completely helpless. They were forced onto the back foot, and quite strongly so. Fourthly, it propelled the rise of Mahatma Gandhi, because it was he who was able to bring Hindus and Muslims onto a common political platform against the British. However, इसमें कुछ limitations भी थी. क्या? It symbolized the communalization of Muslim mass politics. ठीक है? So Muslims had been drawn onto mass politics, but on the basis of a purely religious issue. And this is not a very healthy proposition. Secondly, it also, you can say, weakened the national alliance within the leadership. It weakened the unity of the nationalist leadership. एक साइड पे चैंपियन इमर्ज हुए महात्मा गांधी, एंड दूसरी साइड पे मोहम्मद अली जिन्ना. And ironically, Jinnah emerged as the champion of secularism, while Gandhi emerged as the champion of communalism. While Gandhi advocated for Hindu-Muslim unity, he was definitely contributing to the communalization of Indian politics by uh, enlisting the Congress, which was a secular political party, onto a religious platform of political action. ठीक है? So he was contributing directly to the communalization of Indian politics, while Jinnah was defending its secular credentials. Clear है इतना? Thirdly, in the long run, the Khilafat movement proved to be disastrous for Indian unity. Now, the Khilafat movement and the non-cooperation movement were running parallelly, and Gandhi's decision to withdraw the non-cooperation movement suddenly also meant the withdrawal or simultaneous withdrawal of the Khilafat movement without the fulfillment of the demands of the Indian Muslims. Therefore, Indian Muslims and their leaders began feeling that Gandhi and the Congress had betrayed them. So, withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement also embittered the Hindu-Muslim relations, as Muslims felt betrayed. Fourthly, the Khilafat movement also revived old communal sentiments and grievances, which took an ugly turn in certain places. For example, in the Malabar region, where in the backdrop of the Khilafat non-cooperation movement, which uprising took place? The Mopla uprising, which witnessed large-scale communal violence. And finally, the dilution of the Congress's secular credentials weakened its ideological position in the future. Later on, when Jinnah and the Muslim League started using communal rhetoric in order to mobilize the Muslims in large numbers, the Congress had no way to criticize them because they were the ones who had introduced this strategy. So, the dilution of the Congress's secular traditions by supporting Khilafat weakened its future ideological position. That is, in its communal phase, the Muslim League would blame the Congress for initially communalizing India's mass politics. They argued that since the political development of the Indian masses has taken place in the lines of communal politics, the Muslim League does not have any other option. If it has to gain popularity, it must do so in the name of religion only. And the Congress had no real response for this. तो क्योंकि उन्होंने शुरुआत में तो गलती कर ही दी थी, ठीक है? So this is the significance of the Khilafat movement in Indian history. And finally, you can also link this rising communalism, the tensions between the two leaders, and the tension between the two major political parties to the two nation theory, the Pakistan demand, and the ultimate partition that was accompanied by large scale communal purges, genocides, and violence. ठीक है, तो ये हो जाता है इसका significance. So will you be able to address this question now? What were the major factors behind the Khilafat movement? ये हो जाएगा. Discuss its significance in Indian history. I think ये भी हो जाना चाहिए. You have 5-6 points you can write over here now. Clear? ठीक है. Now, our next topic is obviously going to be the नॉन कोऑपरेशन मूवमेंट। इसमें हम देखेंगे द background of the movement, its merger with the Khilafat movement, its programs, the methods and strategies used by Mahatma Gandhi, the nature of the movement, its features and characteristics, and the debate regarding its withdrawal. ठीक है? These are the things that we have to cover within the non-cooperation movement. Time period 1920 to 22. We are going to do us in our next lecture. क्लियर है? समझ में आया है आज जो जो कवर हुआ है? कोई डाउट्स हैं क्या? नहीं? Abhiram, any doubts? No? All right then. Thank you for your time. I'll see you on Monday. Monday को लेते हैं.